Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Meet the Author webinar. Our curriculum today is Home Food Preservation, developed by the University of Idaho Extension. I'm Elena Massler with the National 4-H Council, and I'll be your moderator today. We have just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. First, some notes on how to maximize your viewing experience. If possible, we recommend using a wired internet connection and closing any programs or browser sessions running in the background. Make sure your flash is enabled and your audio speakers are turned up. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, you can click on the question mark icon at the bottom of your screen, which will take you to the help guide. There are also two documents in the resource list that may help you as well, the webinar technical guide and clearing the cache. Second, the webcast console is customizable, which means that you can open, close, resize, and move any of the windows on your screen. The icons at the bottom of the screen represent various widgets that you can open or close. In addition to the help guide, I'd like to highlight the following. The message icon in the middle of the list opens the group chat box. We recommend that you open this as it's a great way to communicate with fellow attendees, and it's also where you can ask your questions of the presenters. The piece of paper represents the resource list. There, in addition to the technical documents I just mentioned, you'll also be able to view and download a copy of today's presentation. There are also links to Shop 4-H and upcoming webinar registration. And lastly, the person icon is for presenter information, which contains our speakers' bios and contact information. A recorded version of the webcast will be available in approximately 1 day, and it can be accessed using the same link you used to sign on today. Feel free to listen again and also share with your colleagues. And with that, let's get started. Our presenters today are Grace Whitman and Donna Gillespie, both educators with the University of Idaho Extension. Grace and Donna, thanks for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you everybody for coming and joining us for this webinar on the home food preservation curriculum. My name is Grace Whitman, and I am a food safety, nutrition, and 4-H youth development extension educator with the University of Idaho. And we do want to give a quick shout out to our third author who has now retired, Rhea Lanting. And Rhea was a nutrition and 4-H youth development extension educator with the University of Idaho as well. And I'll let Donna introduce herself.
And I'm Donna Gillespie. I was a county educator with Family Consumer Science and 4-H. The last 2+ years, I have transitioned to a job as a regional educator with the state 4-H office, so now currently doing 100% 4-H work in a 10-county area, and then also overseeing all the statewide teen programs in Idaho. So my job's changed a little bit since we wrote this curriculum, but still have a passion with 4-H youth and enjoy the food preservation angle of it. So. Thank you. Thank you for coming today. This is a different venue for me. We use Zoom a lot at the University of Idaho so we can actually see who we're talking to. So I don't know about you, Grace. This seems a little strange to me, not looking at people giving us some feedback in a way.
Yeah, it's definitely different. So really quick, we actually just want to ask a quick polling question just to see who has joined us for this webinar so we have an idea of who we're working with today. Everyone will just click on a role that best describes you. Okay, wonderful. Looks like we have some state staff, some county staff, pretty equal across the board, and then extension educators. Wonderful. Thank you guys for all coming, and get started.
Okay, so I was going to talk just a little bit about where it all began. Grace, Rhea, and I were part of a team in our region down here that did family and consumer science programs and 4-H youth development together. We enjoyed working together. We had a strong team. We were also quite involved with training and working with master food preservers, adults, and saw an increase in the popularity of food preservation, which I think we've seen nationwide, and started to talk a little bit about how it was kind of a generational thing. We had a lot of young people that weren't canning. It was the older generation did more of it, but it was interested in the kids. So we put together a series of Mom and Me food preservation workshops. Lots of times they were Dad and me, or Grandma and me, or the neighbor lady down the road and me. Preservation workshops where it was a direct youth and adult working together in a team approach to learn about food preservation. And from that, there was so much interest in, and we had great success with it, we decided we should put a curriculum together. And Grace is going to talk a little bit more about how the curriculum came about. And when we looked to find other curriculum about food preservation, we were mostly just working out of the USDA materials and canning guides and didn't really have youth development materials. We put together a beginning curriculum. We did some pilot tests in several counties in 2009 and 2010. And because of success and the interest and really how much we enjoyed doing food preservation with kids, that's kind of where it all started and where it went from there. And Grace, I'm going to let you talk a little bit about then the development of the curriculum.
Yeah, so like Donna said, we kind of started into this going, what is out there, what can we use? The state of Idaho had been basically just using the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning, which wasn't very all-inclusive for activities and information and in a nice, I guess, 4-H format for a leader to be able to pick up and use. So we did the pilot testing, we did some research to see what was out there. Basically what we found for Idaho was that either the curriculum that was already out there was outdated or it was very regionally specific. Maybe it didn't include altitude adjustments, which we have to use in Idaho, or it had the use canning or preserving foods that maybe aren't grown in all parts of the United States. So we decided we needed to put something together that could be used not only by Idaho, but hopefully by most states. So with that, we developed 4 different manuals. We have boiling water canning, pressure canning, drying and freezing. You'll notice that drying, freezing, and boiling water canning, we do recommend ages of 8 to 18 on those pieces, but then with pressure canning, we did get a little more restrictive, and we restricted that more to our senior level, ages 14 to 18, just for safety reasons, really. You will also notice, if you look up the curriculum, that we don't have a separate leader's manual. When we put these pieces together, we decided that they needed to be standalone pieces that someone could pick up, and they didn't really have to worry about getting any other pieces to go with them, that they could take the manual. It would have all the information they needed to teach about that preservation method as well as the activities already included. So we didn't necessarily write a separate book for leaders or volunteers. With that, we have one more polling question here. And this is just for us to get an idea of where you think you might be using this piece of curriculum in the future.
The dead air is driving me crazy. Someone moving their head is like, hello, are we still there? Can't see anybody.
Okay.
We're at 17 of 24 submitted, so I think it's safe to move ahead now.
Okay.
Hi, thank you. Great.
That'll work.
This is really different, not being able to look at somebody. Okay. Oh, somebody lost their audio.
Okay.
Darn.
Oh, no. Hopefully nobody else is having that problem. So it looks like about 40% of you, close to 40%, are thinking club youth. And then there's some community club and a little bit with volunteers after school and then adult education. And we've found that adults really do love these pieces as well because they have everything right there included in them. I like to recommend them even for beginner canners, adult beginner canners. They really get a kick out of them. So
Yeah, I have too, because they do start at a level that they can understand. We'll talk a little bit about the content. The 4 manuals, there's a lot of similarities in every one of them. Obviously, there's some specific things on each manual depending on the food preservation type that is covered. But generally, darn, she still can't hear. Well, hopefully we can get that fixed, or be able to go back and read the recording or listen to the recording. So they are standalone manuals. The resources are listed in the front of the book. Each one of the manuals have different resources. Well, some of them so easy preserved, maybe in more than one in the Ball website, but they're specific to the type of canning that there is. But the manuals are standalone, so you could just take the manual and do any of the activities in there, and all the information you need is in the manual. You don't have to have your Ball Blue Book off to the side and your website pulled up and everything to do the work. But that's what makes them, I think, really good manuals, is they are standalone. So the resources are listed in the front. I'm just going to kind of thumb through the freezing one just because I'm more familiar with it. But again, there's a lot of similarities. There are notes to project helpers. We thought it was really important that on these kinds of projects, well, really any 4-H projects, it's that youth-adult partnership working on them. And in canning, it's a great way to learn together and to pass that information along. So there's notes to project helpers about what the responsibility of the project helper is, information about using experiential learning, developing life skills, what life skills they get out of this project, wise uses of resources, communication, healthy lifestyle choices, those kinds of things. So there's a full page of notes to the project helper in there. Then there's a page of My Plans, which is a great place to do some goal setting, to sit down with the project helper or whoever you're working with. It could be adult education too. They have a project helper, I guess. And look ahead at some of the activities and what you want to accomplish. Set some goals together. That would be the time that if you're actually doing it as a 4-H project, to take a look at what your state requirements are there. There's a lot of nutrition information in there. Rhea was our go-to person on that, and there's this Exploring My Plate. Grace is going to talk a little more detail on the nutrition part of it in another slide. But there's a worksheet to help people keep, youth to keep track of what they're eating every day and if they're meeting their goals. There's a section on reading food labels. There's a section on how much should I eat and planning menus. That's all under the Exploring My Plate or the nutrition part section in the book. And then there's kitchen and food safety basics. Again, these are included in all the manuals. Just some really good information about how to be safe in the kitchen, about food safety, information about, cleaning up spills and washing your hands and temperatures and how things are held for all different kinds of foods, as well as the one that you're doing in this project. There's a nice list of types of food preservation. So refrigeration, freezing, canning, these are in all of the manuals, consistency with them. And then it goes into the basics, getting ready, and the activities. And those would be more specific. Obviously, the freezing ones would be different from drying or from pressure cooking or pressure canning, excuse me. So the basics, it includes, why freeze foods, how to freeze foods, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more as we move through the slide set. But the content is all the out in the beginning. There's standalone manuals. The information is really good, and there are consistencies between the manuals, which I think is important. If you're doing more than one with your group, you know that there's some consistencies. If once you've done one manual, it helps you move to the others. At least that's kind of my thought. So, yeah, Grace, let's see. What do we got next?
Okay.
Oh, the nutrition.
So moving into the nutrition section, obviously nutrition we felt was a very important piece to this curriculum, really helping youth understand what they're eating and how they can use those foods they're preserving to help them make a balanced diet. So the section really starts out with 10 tips for healthy eating and looking at My Plate and how you would use My Plate. What does that look like? What are the food groups? And then they do a My Plate activity, which you can see the worksheet right here on this slide. And what that consists of is having the youth record what they eat for an entire day, and then having that thought process, reflecting back on it and saying, what was I missing in my diet? Maybe what did I have too much of in my diet that day? and what are some goals I could have for improving my diet and meeting more of that MyPlate recommendation. So that is the MyPlate activity that goes with this. Next, we talk a little bit about reading a food label and how do you read a food label? What does it mean? What does calories mean? Serving sizes. And then, of course, those percent daily values. I know working with youth, they don't even understand what that is on the side of that label, and they always ask, they're like, what is the percents? We don't understand the percents. So this really helps them start to understand what that is and how they can use it in their diet. We obviously talk about sodium in there and what are the recommendations for sodium and sugars and fiber and vitamins and minerals. Each of these pages also has a little activity called Going Further. So if you were to use this curriculum more than 1 year with some youth, there are some activities that they can take another step with on this. The next piece is how much should you eat? What do portion sizes look like? And really making that a visual activity for them so that they understand what their plates should look like portion size-wise. And then the last piece of the nutrition activities is planning a menu. And this kind of is just an introduction piece for them so that they can start thinking about how to have a balanced diet throughout the day. And then we follow it up with an activity at the very end of each manual that is planning a menu around the foods they have preserved. So how do you use those foods now that you have them? So that's kind of, we try to keep that nutrition aspect in each of these manuals throughout the learning process.
Which I think, Grace, makes it for a really nice tie-in with so many other foods projects that we have, that they get such good background in nutrition here that it can apply to a lot of other things. And I know the food labels, for one, it's interesting to bring in a commercially canned product and compare that to a product that they've done, and they'll have lots of questions about, well, why does it have to have all this preservatives, and why did we have to have all this extra sugar? We didn't do that, and ours is great. So it really opens up a lot of discussion areas, I think.
Yeah, it really does. It really helps the youth decide what they want to put in their diets and how they can help restrict some of that stuff they don't want through preserving their own foods. So it's great.
Should we take a second to answer the question about the question in the chat is, does this entire book become the project book for the fair? In Idaho, what they would have for at the fair, they would bring this manual with 4 or more activities, journal parts completed in it. They had answered 2 questions in the reflection section. They do a leadership activity and then a presentation that goes along with it. So this manual is displayed as well in Idaho as we have a generic project record book and involvement report. So yes, it is part of what in Idaho what they would bring to the fair, because the actual writing and the planning and goal setting and those kinds of things go in this manual. And then just for added information, then there's lots of, on our requirement sheets in Idaho, there's lots of options of things that they could display. Obviously in freezing it's a little hard to take a product that you froze to the fair and leave it there for a week, so they might want to bring a display of the equipment they used, or they could bring a sample of a product that they labeled, or a poster of something they've done, or journals, that kind of thing. The kids that have done drying or boiling water canning or pressure canning might actually bring a product. So I hope that answers your question. Anything else you might add on that, Grace, that you can think?
Yeah, no, I think we'll kind of touch on the requirement type stuff in here in a little bit, but really, I mean, it's up to the state as to what they want to do. But I do recommend that these manuals be a part of the exhibit. It really shows that what the youth have learned, where they've come from, and where they have grown to in the project. So I think that they're a vital part of that judging piece.
Yeah, I do too. So we're going to take just a minute now to go a little bit more detail into each one of the manuals. I did most of the writing work on freezing. Drying was Rhea's project more, and Grace was under the pressure canning and boiling water. So I'll start in on the freezing. I wish you all had it in front of you, but just to tell you just a little bit, there's, again, the resources are listed on this slide, just has a few of them. There's a few more too. And then on the freezing side, we go into a lot more detail about why we freeze foods. You know, it's the easiest, quickest, and most convenient method for most people. There's lots of instructions on here on how to freeze foods. For instance, packing fruit dryer with syrup. We talk about syrup packs, whether light, medium, or heavy syrup packs, which is a really fun thing to do with kids and have them do taste differences on the products depending on what kind of syrup that they used. There's a list of equipment in every manual for the specific type of food preservation technique that we're using. So for freezing, measuring cups and pot holders and spatulas and storage containers and all that kind of information are all listed out. We talk in here about things that you can do to prevent browning in your product, and again, that's another one. It's interesting to have a taste test and have the kids close their eyes and taste things that are ones either hasn't been pre-treated. It might look a little different on the outside, but could taste the same on the inside. That was fun to do. The guidelines for freezing fruit, the book actually, the manual actually includes information about apples, bananas, cherries, pears, peaches, raspberries, strawberries. On the fruit side, on the vegetable side, it's beans and beets and carrots and corn. So, I mean, there's a long list of detailed instructions on how to prepare and how to freeze them, if it needs to be blanched or not, that are in the manual. So, again, it makes it a standalone manual. We talk about freezing vegetables. We talk about freezing meat, fish, and poultry, because that's the first thing, you know, that we think about when we think about what's in our freezer. So it's good to teach everybody how to correctly freeze meat, fish, and poultry, and how long storage times are for that. That's included in the manual. We talk about freezing convenience foods. You know, if you're making waffles on Sunday morning, why not make a bunch of extra and freeze them and use them for your own homemade toaster waffles later in the week. We talk about packaging and labeling your products. Remember, one of the funnest things that we did is we had kids go home and ask their parents if they could do a freezer inventory and come back and tell us what they learned. And it's amazing. The kids would come back and say, well, there's a lot of containers of stuff, and I think it's just got ice in it, and I don't know, there's no label on it. So it was a really good learning experience for us about that. So the kids learned about labeling and putting dates on labels and how to store things and what kind of materials to use and what happens if you just put it in an old oleo container versus a better container. So all that information is included in here. There's also information in here about thawing the product, because obviously if we're freezing it, some products need to be thawed at room temperature, some can have to be thawed in the refrigerator, again on the food safety side. So there's information about that in there too. Again, it seems like we went through that pretty fast. I wish you all had a book to look at. But you could buy one, right? She'll give you more information about that.
Yeah.
So what the activities look like. What's that?
Oh, sorry. I went too far. There you go. Sorry.
So just one
I was just going to say some people have said that they have them in front of them. So that's good.
That's good. That's good. So the kind of activities that are in freezing, you're looking at one. There's the individual quick freeze. Just to read through a few others, it's let's make a fruit smoothie, let's freeze fruit in a syrup pack, dry packing, let's freeze fruit without sugar, let's freeze blanched vegetables, convenience foods. There's lots of activities in the book. We've pulled up this one, let's freeze fruit individual quick freeze, IQF. It's a really good one for kids to see and understand how the things happen. They also might have, you know, strawberries in the garden, or there could be a nice sale of blueberries down at the store, so they get the understanding how economical it is maybe to do some of these things at home. And the technique, you know, is quick freezing on a cookie sheet and then putting them all together, and they're not all stuck together. You don't just get a big old wad of blueberries and you want to put it into your smoothies that you might make for breakfast every morning. So it's a real visual thing that kids can see and understand. Grace will show you that in her books, there's actually recipes to follow, individual quick freeze. There's just more instructions, not really a recipe. But then there's the journaling part on each one of the activities. So the journaling questions in this one is, what fruit did you choose for the IQF? What challenges do you have with the activity? And what would you do differently next time and why? So those journaling questions go along with all the activities in all the books. one of my favorite pictures is Grace and I were talking about this ahead of time. I remember that day. They had a lot of little boys. It wasn't just girls. They had a lot of little boys that came and did the projects. We were actually blanching and freezing carrots that day. And those boys have now graduated, and they were just as ornery as they look in the picture, but it was a really fun day. So think about that. No, okay. Grace, you're up.
Very good. I am, yes. Okay. All right, so boiling water canning. Like Donna said, I was primary author for boiling water canning as well as pressure canning. These manuals will have obviously information that's specific to those types of canning methods. They will look fairly similar in the content that is within them. Both those manuals will. Specifically, things that will be repeated in both the canning manuals are, why do we can foods? What's the purpose of that? And it talks about, we not only preserve foods to, preserve the leftover from our garden, but also to preserve them in the way that we want so that we have the nutrition that we want from them. Low acid versus high acid canning. What is an foods have acid in them. We kind of talk about, what that means and what are those low acids and high acid foods and why do we can them a certain way. Making altitude adjustment, obviously that is a huge concern here in Idaho as well as many other states. We go from anywhere at 900 feet all the way up to 10,000. So so it's something we talk a lot about in Idaho. So we talk about that altitude adjustment and how you make that and why do you need to do that, and boiling water and how it boils at different elevations. Hot packing versus raw packing or cold packing. What does that look like, and why do people pick certain things to hot pack and certain things to cold pack, and how do you actually do those? Some of the topics that would be covered in boiling water canning that might be slightly different in pressure canning would be the selecting of produce. When should you can it? How should you prepare it? The selecting of jars, making sure you don't have cracked jars or chipped rims on your jars, and why that's important. Preparing jars and lids, headspace. Headspace is something that I'm always amazed when I teach classes on preservation, how many people don't recognize the need for headspace in their jars and what it can do if you don't have enough or if you have too much. So, of course, these manuals go into that. See how to fill their jar, that just, that basic, how do you put the food into the jar, especially when it's hot. How to tighten a screw band, one of my favorite things every single time I do this with youth, even when I say, don't put your screw band on until, we've gone through that lesson. There will always be the one kid who grabs that screw band and screws it onto the jar as tight as they can, just as tight as they can put it on there. And so then we have a discussion about why that's not a good plan and how to actually properly put that screw band on so that they get the vacuum seal that they need. Next, how to test for the seal. This becomes super important, especially in the pressure canning, because in pressure, we'll talk a little bit about that, but in boiling water canning, a lot of times when you bring those jars out of the canner, you get to hear the pop from the lids. It'll ping. You hear the little pings all, for the next 10 minutes or so. So, but how can you tell if it has really gotten that seal? Storing your canned foods and labeling them. Obviously, it's not quite as bad as freezing when determining what you have canned, but if you don't label, it can be a guessing game as to when it was canned. You might not remember from year to year, and also what you put into that jar. We talk a lot about, including, is it a low sugar item? Is it got a medium syrup? Anything like that. Is it low salt or, whatever? So making sure you label the product correctly. On page 18, in this manual specifically, it goes into the step-by-step directions on how to use a boiling water canner. So from how much water you need to put into the canner to what the temperature of the water needs to be before you put the jars into it. So it goes into very step-by-step directions so that hopefully it takes away the guessing game of how to use that. Also, just to reiterate, the resources, each one of our manuals used certain resources. You can always go and pull those resources to get more information on things like elevation adjustment and acids and pHs and all of that, so that if a leader wanted to go into more depth or understand more, there's an opportunity for them to go and do that. All right, so activity-wise, so this is a sample activity from the Boiling Water Canning Manual. This one is on a pickle relish. You will notice when you look in these two manuals on canning, each of them will usually have a recipe, a procedure, the processing time, which is that little table down at the bottom there, and then, of course, the journaling activities. Most of the resources used for these recipes was the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning. The reason I used that publication for the most part was because I liked the table format for the elevation adjustment, just so that it was a little bit easier to read and user-friendly for the youth as well as the adults using the curriculum. The journaling questions. This particular activity shows our two main journaling questions that will be pretty much on every single activity. And it's that, what kind of challenges did you have and what would you do differently? And then sometimes you'll see added journaling questions such as, what type of fruit or vegetable did you choose to preserve? And then there could be some other ones in there as well. Basically, this is the idea of really having them think back on the whole activity and what did they struggle with? What did they have a hard time with? Or did it go great? Was it smooth? Maybe they wouldn't change anything. Maybe we wouldn't do anything differently, but we want them to have that thought process and not just do it and leave it. We want them to have that reflection, so that's why those questions are there.
Okay. So this is the drying manual, what it looks like. And again, it has the same information in the front of it, the basic information. And then we start to talk more specifically about drying, which was really Rita's expertise that she brought into us. And there's a nice section on why dry foods. And I remember her talking about, it being the oldest method of food preservation. And if you don't have canning equipment, if you don't have a freezer, a lot of foods were dried, especially during the Depression. It talks about how drying preserves foods and the nutritional value of dried foods. There's questions, it doesn't look like it's very good to eat anymore, and so it's a good time to have that discussion about the nutritional value and what happens to the food when it dries. She did a great job of talking about the methods of drying food, dehydrator drying, advantages and disadvantages, oven drying, advantages and disadvantages, sun drying, advantages and disadvantages, solar drying. So there's a nice section that explains all that. She talks specifically about selecting fruits for drying, how to prepare them for drying, and quite a bit about pre-treating. Youth, I think, are interested that they see dried banana chips or something in the store. And the ones that they're maybe going to do in the class, they don't quite look like that. And how come? It's a good discussion to have about citric acid dips or even honey dips or using sulfur dioxide treatments. And there's good information in here about how some individuals are sensitive and can't eat or shouldn't eat foods that are treated with sulfites. So that's always something to remember and be aware of. Talks about conditioning fruits after they're dried. Are they dry enough to store and storing them? Can you use fruit that you've already canned to go ahead and dry? There's sections that cover that. And then under guidelines for drying fruits, there's a lot. Apples, apricots, bananas, coconuts, figs, grapes. I mean, a very nice long list of how to select that kind of fruit, how to pre-treat it, and how to test for dryness. There's also a nice section on fruit leathers. Kids love fruit leathers. Fruit leathers are always pretty easy to use. It's a good way to, you could do something that kids can take it for a snack, and they're always really proud of what they've done. There's a long section about drying vegetables. how to prepare them, and again, the manual includes charts on a very wide variety of vegetables with details on selection, pre-treatment, and test for dryness. So it's all included right in the manual. There's a section on drying herbs, and then, like all of them, there's another section on packaging and storing and the importance of labeling for all the dried foods. And again, resources listed there too. Let's see. Were all these recipes the USDA approved? Yes, absolutely. Right, Grace? Did you see the question?
Yes, 100%. USDA approved, and they should look very similar to the recipes right straight from the books. We received permission to use everything as it was from the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning, as well as So Easy to Preserve, and any other publications that are listed in our resource list that we use. We had permission to use them as they were written so that they would be a fully safe recommended recipe. I hope that answers those questions.
As far as the recipe on the canning, I don't know if they cite exactly from where they're from originally, but they would be from one of the resources that are listed in the manual.
Yes, so, each recipe is cited.
Great opportunities for a lot of discussion about Grandma does it this way and nobody's died yet, and any of us that have worked in family consumer science on the food preservation have had a million of those questions, but it's a great discussion to have with kids. You know, it's not right or wrong, but these are the recommendations now, and this is why. So yes, these are all USDA approved for sure. The activity we'll cover really quickly in the drawing one is Let's Make Trail Mix. It was always really, really popular. Grace and I were laughing. Actually, the picture is Garrett and I think, making freezer jam, but that's okay. Rhea was always really great about drying stuff ahead because it does take time to dry products. And so she would always have things dried ahead. It's a perfect opportunity to get kids to taste something that they might not taste any other time. So she would dry papaya, or she would dry strawberries or kiwi fruit or star fruit or something that looks cool and maybe kids had never tasted before. So that was always fun to have. The activity talks about how to dry things in the dehydrator, how to check the fruit, make sure it's dried. And then it's fun to have things laid out and kids get an opportunity to go through and pick what they want. She always encouraged them, and we always encourage kids to try everything. Obviously, a lot of discussion about food allergies if there were nuts or something involved. But other than that, try everything. Rice crackers, different kinds of cereal are fun to put in there, and every now and then we could sneak in an M&M if Rhea wasn't watching too close. It's also a great thing to tie into a healthy living activity. So if you're doing an all-day canning workshop with kids in the morning, you get things ready and maybe make a trail mix in the afternoon, go for a short hike someplace if you can and take your trail mix along with you. So it's always a fun activity to do and very popular with the kids. So there's your pressure canning, Grace.
Oops, sorry. Okay, so pressure canning. Like I said, this book is going to look fairly similar to the boiling water canning, especially in those first few basics, why we can foods. Also in that, I didn't highlight this during my talk on the boiling water canning, but I will here, why we can foods. It also talks about the recommended practice, the things that are not recommended as a practice, such as open kettle canning, oven canning, microwave oven canning, all of the things, the dishwasher canning, all of those things that are not recommended to do. We do highlight those just a little bit. Again, there's the canning of low acid versus high acid foods, making that altitude adjustment. So it's in both of these manuals, but of course we adjust for altitude differently, whether you're boiling water canning or pressure canning. So in this manual, it talks about adjusting the pressure as opposed to adjusting minutes for the altitude adjustment. Hot packing versus the cold raw packing, again, we go into that here. The thing that's unique in this book, of course, is selecting a pressure canner. What kind of features does your pressure canner need to have in order for it to be safe to use? So that is included with this as well. And then when you go into selecting produce, not only does it have selecting the produce, but it has selecting your meats, poultry, and fish for canning, because you do want to make sure that it is healthy and from disease-free animals. again, the preparing of jars, lids, headspace, filling the jars, tightening the screw bands, testing the seal. This stuff is all the same as in the boiling water canning, but it is listed here as well, just to make sure it's in both places. Then on page 18 of this manual as well, you will see, again, there is a step-by-step guide on how to use your pressure canner. How do you actually pressure can food in it? The resource that I would probably recommend somebody using alongside this piece of curriculum is our Pacific Northwest publication. This is a publication that is produced by Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. It's our PNW 421, and it's called Using and Caring for Your Pressure Canner. And the reason I like it is it's very concise. It's a small book, but it is something that anyone can pick up and skim through really quickly to remember how much water do I put in that canner again, and if they're using an older canner, it actually has a description of how to test that canner to make sure that it's still working efficiently. So it's kind of a nice, handy little supplement to go along with this if you are not comfortable pressure canning yourself. But then, let's see here, there's lots of resources, again, listed in the front of the manual. That Pacific Northwest publication is downloadable as a PDF, so it's not something, it's something you could get right away if you needed it. Again, we have many activities. This particular one is on Let's Can Vegetables, Spaghetti Sauce with Meat. In my lab activities, I really like to at least have one or two activities that include a mixture, that it's a meat and something else. So I like to do a soup or a spaghetti sauce with meat, something like that, so it combines the two products. A lot of times when you can meat, the kids they just look at it and they're like, oh my gosh, that looks so gross, which I always think is funny because they're kind of right. But it tastes great, so it comes back to that. Sometimes something doesn't look as good as it actually is. Again, this has the recipe with the procedure. You'll notice at the bottom here that it has recommended processing times for both the dial and the weighted gauge canners, which the curriculum does go into the differences of those canners. And again, somebody asked about the resource. You'll see that right up at the top. It says this recipe. Let's see here. It says recipe source, I guess is what it says, and then it lists where the source came from. And you should be able to look that recipe up in that source still to this day. That is an activity, and this one goes into not just, it has activities just on canning vegetables, and then it has doing mixtures, then just canning meats, fish, and poultry, and so it does all of those.
Okay. So I'm looking at the time. Grace and I, we had a lot of fun with rewriting these. We're pretty passionate about this curriculum. So sorry for spending maybe too much time. But thanks for mentioning that PNW, because one of the really good resources that's listed in the freezing one is also Freezing Fruits and Vegetables, PNW 214, which PNW Pacific Northwest is Idaho, Oregon, and Washington Extension working together on publication. It's also downloadable. So, okay, some of the other activities, some of the extra things, these are in all the manuals. For instance, conduct a taste test, really a fun thing to do. We had a really fun night after we had individual quick froze blueberries, I think, and then we made smoothies, and we made them with, a couple of different ways, and had the parents on a test panel, and the kids, it was a big secret, and whose was whose, and it was just a lot of fun. So there's some information on how to conduct a taste test. I've mentioned some other things, fruit in a heavy syrup versus a light syrup, low sugar, low salt, just lots of things to do. There's a create your own activity. An example of that, someone had just remembered their grandmother's apple butter and how wonderful that was, and we were able to go to the USDA publications and find an apple butter recipe, and they were able to produce it, and it was really nice that they could do that and brought back some memories. Label your product. We've already talked about that a little bit and the importance of that. And the embarrassment if you go in your freezer with someone else and they look at it and it's not labeled. And then make a menu plan. the Make a Menu plan. You can go back to the first of the book, the information's there, and then start incorporating some of those food preservation products that you've done with your family. I mean, what's more fun than having a spaghetti sauce that you canned yourself and then planning a nice meal with a green salad or whatever with your family as a menu. So, and the last part is to show what you learned. I think, Grace, you were going to talk about that.
Yeah, so at the very end of every single manual, we have two pieces. One is called Show What You Have Learned, and this is, it's basically about that oral presentation demonstration, and it gives the kids some ideas that they could consider for giving those presentations. And so that's kind of a handy little tool, especially when you're working with those 8-year-olds who are like, I don't know what I should do. This kind of gives them some ideas of where to start to put that presentation together. And the last piece is reflections on either pressure canning, freezing, drying, boiling water canning. And that just really comes back to just having them reflect on the whole project and where they started and where they're at now, and answering some questions. So those are the last two pieces of the manual. And so I guess we're just going to ask if anyone has further questions at this time.
The question about project requirements is really good, and we didn't include, well, Grace, you can talk about that. We talked about that yesterday, why we didn't put specific project requirements in these manuals.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot about that piece. So specific project requirements. You'll notice that none of these manuals do we say what has to be done to complete the project. We have left that up to any state who is using it to kind of develop their own requirements for the project. I know in Idaho, we sometimes don't always follow those requirements that come with curriculum, and so then it gets a little confusing between the volunteers and the offices as to what the youth should be completing. So we've left that so that each state can develop their own requirements and what that should look like for them. You know, we're pretty basic here in Idaho. I think our requirements is they need to complete 7 activities, do an oral presentation, so many learning activities, and then of course have their display and record book and everything at the fair. So, you know, we just kind of wanted to leave that more open for each of the states to use it how they want.
Mm-hmm. Well, hope you'll give them a try. Like I said, they're fun to do with adults. They're fun to give with youth. I've given them out as gifts for people who said that they're interested in start canning. And then just working with the youth for really what they're developing with the 4-H kids. And we've just had a lot of fun doing that. It's been very rewarding.
It's Selena with National 4-H, and if anyone has any questions, type them in the group chat box as you've been doing. I'd just like to thank Grace and Donna for spending the time not only to develop the manuals, but also for sharing all this information with us. We definitely can hear the passion, and I want to go do all of the activities right now myself also. So maybe I'll be one of your adult learners next. But while we're waiting for any questions or comments, I'll just make a couple of announcements. And the first is that our annual curriculum sale is right around the corner. It's April 1st through the 30th, and all curriculum and most of our educational kits are 25% off, so including this curriculum. So it's a great time to plan ahead for the new project year. And I'm also excited to announce that our curriculum catalog is done, and I'm going to put a link in the group chat box where you can view the digital version of the catalog, and we'll be mailing out printed copies, and those will be hitting homes and offices, I believe, the last week of March, so stay tuned for that. And I'd also like to mention that we are wrapping up our webinar series here. We just have one more week of webinars, but as I mentioned earlier, this webinar is recorded. All of our webinars have been recorded, so you can check out the Shop 4-H page about webinars to learn about some other great pieces of curriculum that we have. And thank you, everyone, for your nice comments. That's a nice testament to Grace and Donna's work here. Okay, it looks like I'm not seeing any questions coming in at this point. So, Grace and Donna, do you have any closing remarks?
I just like, if anybody has questions that come up later on, you can always track us down with University of Idaho, and shoot us an email or give us a phone call. Donna and I are always happy to help out in any way we can with these. Also, usually your local, Family Consumer Science Extension educator, if it's more specific to the type of processing that's going on, you can always contact them as well. So.
Yeah, for sure. If we can help with anything or answer any questions about maybe how we set it up and worked, with the youth. Like I said, that what we started with the mom and me or the dad and me, that was a lot of fun and it worked really well. And it's nice to have a pretty good adult to youth ratio when you're doing these food preservations. At least I think it's a little easier.
Yeah. Yeah, doing applesauce with like 20 kids is always fun.
Yeah.
It's nice to have a few more adults hanging around.
Okay, well,
food preservation is scary for people too, and I think this breaks it down in kind of a way that's maybe not simpler, but easier to understand, and it's not quite so scary to take on some of these things that you thought were a lot of smoke and mirrors, and they're really not.
Yes, definitely. I've seen the books, and that's very true. Pretty step-by-step things. Okay, well, it looks like there aren't any other questions coming in, just a lot of great comments, so that's really nice to hear. So again, thanks to Grace and Donna for their time today. Thanks everyone for attending. We had a really great turnout and participation, and I hope everybody enjoys using this curriculum and enjoys the rest of their day. Bye-bye.